This is the story of the moment that broke R-Truth. And it isn't what you think. When news broke that WWE had released him after 17 years, the wrestling world was shocked. Here's a man who has given everything to the company for almost 2 decades, just to get released without warning. But behind all the laughs, all the comedy segments, all the chaos, Truth was carrying a deeper pain that nobody could see. A pain that started in childhood and never stopped haunting him. A pain that stemmed from a moment when everything he thought he wanted turned into everything he couldn't escape. To truly understand what broke R-Truth, we have to go back to where it all started. Truth's childhood. Growing up in Charlotte, North Carolina, Truth always had a passion for performing. Music, hip-hop, breakdancing. But it wasn't just about the art. It was about the eyes watching him, the applause, the admiration. From a young age, Ron Killings craved something more. He wanted to be loved by the audience. He wanted that rush, that validation that only comes when a crowd chooses you. While other kids played sports for fun, Truth saw the stands. He saw people cheering, and deep down, that little boy wanted people to cheer for him. He wanted the spotlight. But when you're desperate for the spotlight, when you need it like oxygen, you'll do anything to get it. And Truth did just that. He started dealing cocaine on the streets to fund his music career. The irony of this situation was that the very thing that was supposed to get him love became the thing that was destroying his life. 4 arrests, 13 months behind bars, all because that little boy inside him was screaming for attention, for respect, for someone to notice him. The music studios didn't care about a drug dealer from Charlotte. The record labels weren't calling. The music dream was dying, and the spotlight he craved felt further away than ever. Truth was staring at a dead end, watching his childhood dreams slip through his fingers like smoke. But then, in a halfway house, a man named Jackie Crockett saw something in Truth that would change everything. He saw a performer who could capture a different kind of crowd. Pro wrestling wasn't what Truth imagined for himself. But if it could give the spotlight he'd been searching for his whole life, maybe it was worth a shot. By 1999, Truth had worked his way up from small promotions to the biggest stage in the world, WWE. As K-Quick, he quickly made a name for himself in the WWE. Hardcore Championship, main roster, the crowd cheering for him. It looked like Truth was on the path to finally have his moment in the spotlight. But here's the thing about WWE. They saw him as just another side act. Truth was getting the attention, sure, but it wasn't the respect he craved. He wasn't the star, he was the sideshow. The little boy inside him was still hungry, still wanting more, still craving that spotlight. But before any of that could happen, in 2001, WWE released him. Just like that, the biggest stage in the world had decided he wasn't good enough. The little boy had been rejected by the crowd once again. But sometimes, rejection becomes the greatest gift you never saw coming. After getting released by the WWE, Truth found himself in a new company called Total Nonstop Action. And for the first time in his career, Truth finally got to showcase what he really was. Not a throwaway act, not a sidekick, but a main event player. TNA didn't just see a rapper from Charlotte who could entertain the crowd. They saw Ron the Truth Killings, a wrestler who could carry their company and be the face of their brand. In 2002, Truth did something that no African-American wrestler had ever done before. He won the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. This wasn't just any title. It was one of the most prestigious championships in professional wrestling history. It was the same belt that legends like Harley Race and Ric Flair had held in their prime. And this was just the beginning of Truth's run in TNA. Truth would go on to headline shows alongside wrestling legends like Sting, AJ Styles, and Kurt Angle. These weren't charity matches. These weren't comedy segments. These were main events where Truth belonged at the top of the card, where his name was on the marquee in the same font size as the legends. For 5 years, Truth lived the dream he'd been chasing since childhood. 2 NWA World Championships, tag team success. The crowd knew his name, they respected his work, they saw him as a star, but there was always that voice in the back of his mind, that same voice that had been whispering to him ever since he was a kid, the same voice that wanted the biggest spotlight to be on him. TNA gave Truth everything he thought he wanted: respect, championships, main event status. But that little boy inside him was still looking up at the mountain, wondering what it would feel like to conquer the biggest peak of all. In 2007, Truth made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He was going back to WWE, back to the company that had rejected him, back to prove that he wasn't just a side character. But soon enough, Truth found that it'd be a whole different story than he expected. In 2008, Ron Killings walked back into WWE as R-Truth, carrying 5 years of main event credibility from TNA. He'd proven he could be a world champion. He'd shown he belonged at the top. Surely WWE would see what TNA had seen, right? They didn't. R-Truth was back in the mid-card, back to fighting for scraps, back to being treated like he was lucky just to be there. The United States Championship came and went, but Truth was still miles away from the spotlight he had been chasing. For 3 years, that little boy inside him watched wrestlers like John Cena, CM Punk, and Randy Orton headline WrestleMania while he fought on the undercard. The same hunger that had driven him to deal drugs for his music career was eating him alive. He had the talent. He had the experience. He had everything except the one thing he'd always craved. The main event, the respect, the spotlight, and the acknowledgement that he was more than just a side character. But in 2011, something inside Truth snapped. He was tired of waiting, tired of being patient, tired of watching others get what he deserved, and WWE was about to give him exactly what he'd been asking for. But little did anyone know, this would turn into the moment that'd break Ron Killings forever. In 2011, Truth's patience finally ran out. He turned heel and started attacking fan favorites and ranting about conspiracy theories. He introduced the world to his imaginary friend Little Jimmy and forced his way to the top of the card. It was unhinged, it was desperate, and it worked. For the first time since returning to WWE, Truth got his shot. The main event, against John Cena for the WWE Championship. Everything that little boy from Charlotte had dreamed about was finally within reach. The spotlight was within Truth's grasp. This was the moment Truth had been fighting for his entire life. The crowd was watching. The stakes were real. This was his chance to prove he belonged at the very top of the mountain. But he lost. But it wasn't just losing that broke Truth. It was the realization that came after. WWE had given him everything he'd asked for. The main event, the championship match, the spotlight. And he still wasn't enough. The ceiling was real. And he'd just hit it. That night, Truth understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He would never be the guy. No matter how hard he worked, how much he sacrificed, how desperately that little boy inside him screamed for validation, he would always be one level below where he wanted to be. But this wouldn't be the last time Truth faced John Cena. Years later, their paths would cross again in what would become Truth's biggest career moment. For now, though, Truth had to accept a different reality. If he couldn't be the star, maybe he could find another way to get that love he'd always craved. Truth made a choice. If WWE wouldn't let him be the hero, maybe he could be something else entirely. Enter the comedy era. Truth started doing things that made no logical sense. He brought a ladder to the Royal Rumble, thinking it was money in the bank. He got confused about which pay-per-view he was at. He talked to imaginary children. He interrupted random segments. It was ridiculous. It was absurd. And the fans absolutely loved it. For the first time in years, Truth was getting genuine reactions from the crowd. It wasn't the respect he'd always craved, but it was something almost as valuable, genuine affection. The crowd wasn't laughing at him, they were laughing with him. They were invested in his segments. They were waiting to see what he'd do next. That little boy inside him was finally getting fed, even if it wasn't the meal he'd originally ordered. But Truth was about to stumble into something that would change everything, something that would give him a chance to showcase his talent on a whole different level. In May 2019, WWE introduced something that hadn't been seen in nearly 2 decades, a championship that could change hands anywhere, anytime. The 24/7 Championship. And if that concept sounded familiar, it should have. It was basically the Hardcore Championship reborn. Truth had held that Hardcore title back in 2001 as K-Quick. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just a participant in the chaos, he was the architect of it. Within hours of the title's creation, Truth captured it. And what followed was pure magic. Truth turned the 24/7 Championship into must-see television. Airport chases, backstage ambushes, social media segments that went viral faster than WWE could post them. Truth was everywhere, running from everyone, turning a simple championship into one of the most entertaining parts of the show. But here's what made it special. Truth wasn't just wrestling other mid-card guys. The 24/7 title run gave Truth the opportunity to share screen time with main event players like Brock Lesnar, Bobby Lashley, and Randy Orton in a way that felt organic, not forced. Truth made the most out of these opportunities and turned himself into a household name that everybody loved. Truth held the title 54 times. He broke every record, turning what could have been a throwaway gimmick into one of the most entertaining parts of Monday Night Raw. For the first time in a decade, Truth was introducing himself to a whole new generation. Kids who didn't know about K-Quick or his TNA World Championships. They just knew this funny guy who could make them laugh while somehow always ending up back with the gold. But all of that success, all of that fan love, all of those viral moments were building towards something bigger. Something Truth didn't even see coming. Truth's chance at redemption, the biggest opportunity of his life, his final shot at the spotlight. For months, Truth had been doing something that seemed absolutely ridiculous on the surface. He kept calling John Cena his childhood hero. The problem? Truth was 5 years older than Cena. It made no logical sense. Fans laughed. Commentators rolled their eyes. It was classic R-Truth comedy. But maybe it wasn't comedy at all. For Truth, Cena was everything he had always wanted to be, but never could. The face of the company, the guy who got the biggest reactions, the wrestler who kids looked up to, who adults respected, who held the WWE Championship 16 times while Truth watched from the sidelines. Cena represented something Truth's inner child had been chasing his entire life, the spotlight. When Cena's music hit, 50,000 people erupted. Half loved him, half hated him, but everyone cared. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone was invested. Cena had the spotlight. That's what Truth meant when he called Cena his childhood hero. It wasn't about age. It wasn't about when they were actually kids. It was about that little boy inside Truth who looked at Cena and saw what he'd always wanted to become. The admiration, the respect, the spot at the top of the mountain that Truth had been climbing his whole life. So when Truth kept saying, "John Cena is my childhood hero," he wasn't being delusional. He was being honest in the most vulnerable way possible. He was admitting that part of him would always be that kid from Charlotte, looking up at someone who had everything he'd ever wanted. But in 2025, something changed. Cena turned heel, abandoning everything Truth had admired about him. And suddenly, Truth's biggest hero became his biggest disappointment. The stage was set for the most personal match of Truth's entire career and his final shot to rewrite history. After years of calling John Cena his childhood hero, Truth finally got what he'd been waiting for. But not the way he'd imagined. Cena had turned heel and sold his soul to become world champion for a record-breaking 17th time. He even attacked Truth at a press conference and put him through a table with an attitude adjustment. The hero had become the villain. But for Truth, this was more than just another feud. This was his chance at redemption. His opportunity to rewrite the story from 2011. His shot to prove that the little boy from Charlotte who'd been chasing the spotlight his whole life could finally catch it. The stage was set. Saturday night's main event. 14 years after capital punishment, Truth was back in a marquee match against wrestling's biggest star. This was Ron Killings, getting one more chance to show the world who he really was. For 5 minutes, Truth got a taste of the biggest spotlight. Truth looked like he belonged on the biggest stage with the biggest star. He went blow for blow, the fans were behind him, and for 5 minutes, Truth was holding his own against the biggest star in wrestling. But in the end, Truth came up short. Again, Cena hit the AA, and just like that, the dream was over. Truth had gotten his chance to rewrite history, his opportunity to finally climb to the very top of the mountain he'd been scaling since childhood, and he'd fallen just short of the summit, again. 2 weeks later, the news broke. WWE had released R-Truth. After 17 years with the company, after entertaining an entire generation of fans, after giving everything he had to the craft, it was over. Truth never became the top guy he'd dreamed of. But here's the thing about Truth's story. Truth may never have gotten the spotlight he craved, but he got something better. He got love. Real, genuine love from fans who appreciated everything he gave. The little boy from Charlotte never became the king, but he became something more important. He became beloved. The moment that broke R-Truth ended up being the moment that rebuilt him and cemented his legacy in wrestling history forever.